So welcome again to the Plant Materials Center. I'm David Kidwell-Slack, as I said before, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the cover crop rate trial that we have, and specifically how cover crop planting and cultivation affects soil health. So in this field, last year we had like a soybean crop, and I think it failed. We just didn't get rain at the right time. And now we planted in cover crop back in September. And in this case, does anybody know what this grass is? It is cereal rye. It's the most planted cover crop in Maryland, and probably the most planted cool season cover crop in the US. It is in flower now, and it's going to set seeds soon. You plant it in anywhere from September through December, and you get a decent amount of biomass, and it can get pretty tall. You know, on the eastern shore, on like a well-fertilized soil, it can get 6 feet tall or more by this time of year. Most farmers will terminate the cereal rye prior to planting, say, corn or soybeans again. And they usually do it by spraying herbicide, but there are other ways to terminate it, like by mowing. In this case, this is far enough along that as it starts to flower like this, you can mow it to terminate. Like if you just came out here and mow like we did, the plants aren't coming back. They're done for the year. That's what makes it an annual crop, is that after it flowers, it's done. Sort of like sunflowers. After they flower, they don't come back, they're just done. It's the same with the cereal rye. And in this case, we also planted a couple of legumes in here as well. You can see the purple flowers there. Does anyone know that plant? That's hairy vetch, which is one of the more common legume crops in Maryland. Does anybody know why we plant legumes as a cover crop?
They're good at nitrogen fixing.
Right, they fix nitrogen. We also, in a little bit, we'll walk down and we'll see some crimson clover, which is the other legume that's planted here. Does anybody know that one of the challenges of growing vetch as a cover crop? Like, it's good that it has nitrogen. What's like a con about it? It becomes a weed, and it's because when it sets the seeds, some portion of those seeds are hard, meaning they'll live 2 years. So it'll set the seed, and then it'll be viable 2 years down the road, which means you can end up having weeds in your field because they'll just keep coming, and there's a chance that you won't want it anymore. Crimson clover does that as well, but a little bit less. There's a little bit less hard seed, especially if you terminate it at the right time. Hairy vetch is an annual, so what does that mean it does? It does its life cycle in a year. So this is another one. If you mow it or spray it when it's in flower like this, it's going to kill it. However, if you mow it prior to it going in flower, it will just come right back. You could mow it all year and it would just kind of keep coming back over time. You've got to get it right when it's in flower, like 50% bloom, and then cut it and it's going to die. And it's the same with the crimson clover that we'll see in a few minutes as well. If it's in mid-bloom, you cut it, it will die. But otherwise, you cut it early, it's going to regrow. In terms of rates, so this is a rate trial thing. We planted, this is sort of a little bit of an unusual rate. We did 24 pounds of rye, which as you learn more about cover crops, you'll know that that's kind of a low rate. A lot of times, if you have just a pure stand of rye, you'll go 60 to 120 pounds per acre. We just did the 24 pounds because we added in those legumes and they take up some of the growing space of that total cover crop. So in this case, it was 12 pounds of the hairy vetch, which is growing up some of the plants here, and it's the purple flower back there, or 12 pounds of the crimson clover, which is further down the field that we'll see in a minute. So when you do a mix, you're going to plant less of the grass and less of the legume than you would if you just had a pure stand. If you did a pure stand of clover, maybe you'd plant it at 30 pounds per acre instead of 12. If you did a pure stand of vetch, you might do like 20 pounds per acre instead of 12. Is anybody familiar with the difference in seed sizes? It's sort of an obvious question, right? Different plants have different size seeds. So hairy vetch there's about 20,000 seeds per pound, which is similar, say, to like rye or like wheat berries. If you've ever bought wheat berries to eat, wheat is around 22,000 seeds per pound. Whereas the crimson clover is much, much smaller. Does anybody want to take a wild guess how many seeds in a pound of crimson clover? Yeah, it's about 1.5 million. So it's a lot more seeds per pound. So when you plant 12 pounds of crimson clover, you're going to get 24 times as many plants as you would out of hairy vetch. And why would you still plant similar rates of the two? It's like, why would you have, like, say, 20 million crimson clover plants versus, say, 2 million vetch plants per acre.
What do they require?
Right, they're different sizes, so they have different requirements. The vetch can grow, we have some vetch up near the seed cleaning building. You can see it's one plant is about 3 feet by like 2 feet tall by 3 feet wide. It's a bush almost. Whereas a single crimson clover plant you'll see in a few minutes is about maybe 18 inches tall and about 4 inches wide. So the reason you would plant a lot more of the crimson clover is because the plants are much smaller than the vetch. And the vetch is capable of climbing up these plants. And of course, it's going to begin to do what to the understory and everything beneath it? It's going to shade it. So there's only so many vetch you can get per acre because it wants to climb and shade. It doesn't want to be constrained. If you had too much rye and not enough vetch, the vetch is going to be very thin and spindly because it's going to try to reach up to the light, and you're not going to end up with much nitrogen. So you need that. There's a sweet spot where you have enough plants per acre that you get nitrogen, but not so many that you're shading everything. Does that make sense? So that's why seed rates kind of matter, can matter quite a bit depending on your goals. That's an excellent question. So the reason you would vary the different mixes you use, there's a number of reasons. One would be what your goal is. If your field needs a little bit more nitrogen and maybe fertilizer is very expensive, not that any of us know that right now, but you would do more vetch because you would want more nitrogen. But that being said, you do sacrifice some biomass for organic matter. I'm gonna talk about that more in a minute. The more stuff you have above ground, the more biomass, which is good for organic matter. Why? Right, because when you cut it or when you roll it or when you terminate it in any way, it becomes part of the soil over time. You're not taking it off usually. Some people will hay this, but if it's a cover crop, we really just want it terminated and then left in place to build that organic matter over time. So you do sacrifice some organic matter by going with more legumes, but you get more nitrogen. But to answer your question a little bit further, another reason you might have more of a mix would be crop timing. So this rye is pretty far along and needs to be terminated like now. But let's say you want to plant a much later crop, like a summer vegetable. Well, you might pick a grass that matures later in the season, like oats, because that gives you an extra month of biomass accumulation before you put your vegetable in. If you cut this now and you're not putting vegetables for a month, there's nothing growing there. Whereas if you had oats, let's say, you could cut it in like the end of May and then put in vegetables. Does that make sense? So that's part of the goal. And then from the soil health perspective, which is why we're here, another reason to have diversity, say with legumes of vetch and clover, is that those plants are going to feed the soil a little bit differently. Some microbes are going to like the vetch roots more, some are going to like clover more, some are going to like rye more. And then yet a further goal with soil health is the ratios of carbon to nitrogen. A vetch plant is going to have a fair amount of nitrogen, as we've discussed. And what is the rye plant going to have a lot of? Carbon. The older rye gets, the more and more carbon it has. So if we let this go all the way to seed, it's almost all carbon. There's a little bit of nitrogen left in the seed heads, but the stover, the leftover plant parts are going to be really high in carbon. So if you let this go all the way, you end up tying up some nitrogen in order to break this down, say in June. Whereas if we cut it right now, it's at a ratio that's a little bit more compostable by the soil. It's going to be able to use up, because what does a microbe need to break down carbon? Nitrogen, right? So microbes really need nitrogen to be able to break down carbon. So you have to have some there. And if you have none there, it's going to take a while for them to get enough nitrogen from the atmosphere and other sources. So that's another reason you have a mix, is that you get that diversity for the soil and for breakdown and for better accumulation of organic matter more quickly. So in this case, this was not the best combination because this rye is a little bit early maturing. This one is called Renza Bruzi, and it matures a little bit earlier than others. And you're right, if we just cut this now, like we just come in with a flail mower, that vetch will come back because it's not in bloom. The rye will be done, but the vetch will come back. So in this case, your best method for terminating this would be to spray it. Or let the rye go further, flail mow the whole thing when the vetch is in bloom. So this, we're a little out of cycle. We either have to spray or mow later, otherwise the vetch comes back. So the later we go, the more our carbon goes up. But in theory, our vetch is still pulling down nitrogen the whole way, so it may keep, we don't know. Most of the time in Maryland, it is a race to the finish. It's like which one is going to be there at what time. And that's partially seasonal dependent, right? Like At this point, the rye doesn't need much moisture. It's pretty good, but the vetch does. So if we all of a sudden snap into a dry spell for the next 3 weeks, that vetch might not do a lot. So it is somewhat weather dependent. So to further answer your question as well, one of the reasons we like crimson clover here in Beltsville, and we'll see it again, like I said, in a minute, is crimson clover, specifically the variety Kentucky Pride, matures almost at the same time as the rye. So as the rye is in 50% bloom, the Kentucky Pride clover is often in 50% bloom. So you can mow them both and you get the most benefit, and they're more or less in sync. So that helps us out. Vetch, we would need to either, like I said, plant a later rye or a different legume altogether. And the other another grass altogether. So that might be something like black oats or triticale or barley is another good one. So we will terminate it, but not yet. We're gonna let that vetch go further. We're not so concerned about the rye being a little bit higher in carbon, because this isn't a field that we need to have in a cash crop this year. We're gonna need to get this a bit more regenerated, and I'm gonna talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So we're gonna let this go until that vetch is 50% bloom, and then we will mow it. The mowing gets you a little bit faster breakdown than just spraying, because you're severing ends, and it speeds up decomposition a little bit. I imagine the soil scientists mentioned our soils here in the pits this morning. Did they specifically say that our soils here are droughty, low fertility, and low pH? They didn't say that. They were supposed to. I told Phil they got to say our soils are, and that's what he told me yesterday. So I was like, you got to tell everybody. Our soils are a little bit droughty. They drain quickly, as you saw this morning, an inch in a minute and 8 seconds. They're very sandy loams. Very, very true. They are low fertility, low natural fertility, and then they are a little bit low pH. So to get a better crop of cash crop, we need to lime and fertilize heavier than we have been. And that's just taken some learning to get there. So this isn't going to go cash crop. We're probably going to go back into it with another summer cover to try to build more of the nutrition, probably like sun hemp or partridge pea or another legume that will fix that nitrogen all summer as well. So that's why we're not in a rush to do anything with the rye, even though it's ready to be terminated. So having said that about the soils, which is one of the most important things, we're going to walk up the field in a minute, and you're going to see a gradient. The rye here is about 50 inches tall, so it's a little bit more than 4 feet. And this is a pretty healthy stand. So here's our little yardstick, and this is our 4-foot mark. So the rye it's a little bit more than 4 feet. It's probably about 50 inches. 3 feet, 2 feet. I mean, my mistake. 5 feet. It's a little more than 5 feet tall. This is the 5-foot mark. So this is like 60 inches, 64 inches. 4 foot, 3 foot. As we walk through the field, we're going to see a change in height, and it's because the field becomes more well-drained the further up you go. More well-drained is even less fertility, is even less available nutrients. It's, everything about it just becomes a little bit leaner, and you will see that as we walk up. And that has an impact on that biomass that I mentioned. So how much biomass is good for soil health? It's more, right? More, lots. You want as much as you can get. And when we get up there to the lean part, you'll see how very little there really is. So to try to give you an example, yesterday I cut just a little square. I got out like a ruler and cut a square of all the material that was growing right here on the corner. You can see it here. You can pass it around. I dried it in the convection oven last night to take a dry mass. You can just feel how dry it is, basically. So you take dry matter is one of the best ways to determine your biomass yield, because if you cut it and measure it when it's fresh, it could be full of water because it just rained, and so you don't have a good number, or it could be limp or like wilting because it hasn't rained, and so you don't have a good number. But if you dry it, you know what the actual mass is. You're not worried about water content. So that's the portion from up here. And when you get down to the leaner area, I'll show you that portion. But so this bag basically equates to about 5,700 pounds per acre of biomass, which is, it's pretty good. 5,700 pounds per acre it's going to build some soil health. We like that number to be even higher. 6,000 to 8,000 would be great. That's when you really begin to see more returns in soil carbon and better root penetration because there's just more stuff growing. So that's a pretty, 5,700 pounds is pretty good for May 10th. If we let this go, we let that vetch keep growing, in the next 3 weeks, that number will probably get up to about 7,000 pounds. If we get good rain and all that, and it's mostly that mass will come out of the vetch. This rye is not getting us any more biomass. Once it starts to flower, it's not growing anymore. It's just converting from within the stem to the seed head. Does that make sense? So, like I said, we will let this go and we probably will get some returns. If you're ready, we can walk up and see the leaner area and then you can hear a little bit more about the biomass numbers. So once we get up here, you can see that the stands thin out, even though it was the same seed rate. You can look, we got over an inch of rain on Saturday and already this soil looks dry again. Again, it is a high sand content, but it doesn't have a lot of organic matter. You can see even the weeds don't grow that well. I did cut the rye that was here, but otherwise there's just a little bit of like chickweed, and there's a plant called knall that grows out here that likes low fertility soils. So it's pretty wimpy. And then in terms of the rye, the height of the rye, you can see it's much less. Before we were up at like 64, 65 inches, and now we're down at like 48 at best. And some of these are down below 3 feet. That one's below 4. So the height has gone down. And there's very little vetch growing here. Even though it was planted, there's only like a couple plants interspersed. If they germinated, they just didn't survive the winter. And it may be because it was just so poor quality that there just wasn't enough for them to derive energy from. So then when I took the cutting here, you can pass this around if you want. You can see it's a much less mass for the same area. So you take constant area, you keep that same area and then dry it down and measure it. All right, so that last one was 5,700 pounds, which is what we're looking for. Any guesses on what this area here might be in pounds per acre? 1,600. So it's a good bit less than a third of what the other one was. And 1,600 pounds, like you kind of wasted your time a little bit. I mean, it's better than leaving it bare, but when you mow this down, the breakdown energy is gonna be about as much as what you had. So it's like you're not gaining anything, you're just sort of spinning your wheels a little bit. And so what would have fixed this problem? Fertilizer. It's counterintuitive. Most people don't think about fertilizing their cover crop, right? Because you think, I'm planting rye to take up excess nutrients. In this case, this soil is probably poor enough that fertilizing the cover crop would have gave us a net gain. Like putting in fertilizer like after we planted, like the 3rd week of September, we would have gotten better growth out of the rye and the vetch, and then it would have survived the winter better, grown better in the spring, and then we would actually have a biomass that's accumulative as opposed to not. So it's counterintuitive. Again, most farmers are going to fertilize much more heavily in their cash crop season. They probably will have excess nutrients, but on the off chance they don't, if it's a poor field, fertilizing that cover crop can actually net you a benefit. That's also considering last year's fertilizer prices, not this year's. This year's fertilizer prices, maybe you don't do that, but or find someone who can get you chicken manure for cheap, or you got to find some alternatives there. But so that is a little bit counterintuitive, that fertilizing. The other thing we could have done, again counterintuitive, is to irrigate. If we had irrigation, we might have had better establishment earlier, and the whole thing could have gone better. And that's another thing you usually don't think about. Irrigating your cover crops, but it's definitely a viable option. So we're going to walk up a little further and then we can see our better stand of crimson clover. And as I mentioned, a clover plant is itself generally not very big. So pull these up. So you'll find out when you check out the no-till planter how planting happens. If you've never seen that, they basically get planted in the same physical space. The 2 seeds drop down together just like a 1/2 inch apart, and that's why you have the cereal rye and the crimson clover growing right next to each other, because they were put in the same spot. And for cover crops, that's fine. You wouldn't necessarily do this if it was like corn. You'd want the corn to have a little bit of room to grow, not just crammed up on each other. But to my point, this is a crimson clover plant. It's very different from a vetch that can climb and grow 3 feet in every direction. And this is why you can have 1,000,000 of these where maybe you only have 20,000 of the, or 200,000 of the vetch. They're just a lot smaller than the vetch plants. And then there's your rye. Another little point of mention for plant health, which is what one of the things we do here at the PMC. Does anybody know what it's called when you have like multiple stems of one grass plant? And this applies to every grass.
Oh, it was in the plant ID training.
It is a plant ID thing. What do you call these little guys? They're like multiple grassy bits. Tillers. Tillers. So this plant has, this is a rye plant with like say 7, maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 tillers, which is okay. You know, on a really fertile field, you'll see rye plants with 12, 15, 20 tillers. It'll be like, you know, bigger than your hand of big stemmy stuff. That's generally a good giveaway in the winter as to how well your plants will do. If you come out after a rye planting and you see like 3 tillers in like January, it's probably not going to go great. If you see 10 or 15, it's probably going to be fine. This one was 6, which is like very mediocre. I wouldn't say that's good. It's not bad, it's just not good. The other thing is like they're not particularly green, right? They're sort of yellowish green. A really healthy, well-fertilized rye plant is going to be much darker green than this. You can kind of look around and I don't know if you all see it, but to me, I see yellow-green everywhere I look. Does that seem fair? It's not like a bright, robust, tall fescue grassy green. It's okay. One final thing that someone had asked about diversity with planting. The other benefit of crimson clover is that, do you see a benefit it provides us other than just diversity in the soil and nitrogen fixation? Can you think of another thing it's doing for us?
Forbs.
What about forbs? Wildlife. What about wildlife?
It's a pollinator species, isn't it?
Right. It's providing nectar and pollen to bees, ground nesting bees, and other. Is the rye doing that? No, there's no. It's a wind pollinated plant, so it's not providing nectar or pollen to any pollinators, whereas the crimson clover definitely is. And that's another reason we plant a mix, is we get benefits from multiple facets. Of course, this time of year, there's a lot of things in bloom, so this isn't like. The crimson clover isn't like keeping them alive, it's just an added benefit. And as I say that, there's a honeybee right back there on one of the plants. One of the things I wanted to mention was, did y'all hear me say 50% bloom before? Does anybody know what that means?
So like 50% of the plants are in full bloom.
Right. And you know, if you don't, like this is another single clover plant. You can tell it just has the one root. The difference is that last one had, what, 1 stem? This one has 3. These are not called tillers. I don't know what they're called. Stems, rhizomes, I really don't know. But this one's got 3 of them. And you could look at it and be like, oh, it's got 3 flowers. So it's like 100% bloom. Or with clovers anyway, you can look at all these down here have already bloomed. These, I'm getting ahead of myself. This is actually a cluster of like a couple hundred flowers. And all the bottom ones have already bloomed, and all that's left is the tip. This one is actually probably around what % bloom, do you think?
75.
Yeah, it's probably 75%. So for this clover, if you had a field in this state, rye's in bloom, clover's in 75% bloom, you can do whatever, terminate, mow it, spray it, plant green. I mean, this is a thin enough stand that you just drag a no-till drill right in it and be done. You could roll it if you really wanted to. Yeah, so I'd say this one is like 75%. Some of these are a little bit earlier, like say this one. This one's like not even probably 20% bloom. Like these are the buds. These little pink fuzzy guys, they're just coming in. This one's just opening. This one's probably like 20% bloom. This one's 75 and they're in the same field. So what would you call the field? 50%, right? Because clover does, you know, like any plant, they're not completely uniform. They're going to have differences.
When you say roll, do you mean like an actual just like flatten it all down?
Yeah. So when you get to the equipment display, we have a roller crimper,
Okay.
which has the fluted helical thing. So what it does is as it drives forward, it presses all of the grasses and stuff down, and it crimps it in that it bends it and then shoves it down into the soil. So it's actually like breaking the rye and the clover down into a little furrow in the ground,
Oh, okay.
which supposedly helps speed up decomposition because the microbes are like right there.
Yeah.
But this is all based on like moisture and soil quality. It works a little bit better on heavier soils than sandy, because on a sandy soil, like, is it really going to hold? You know, this isn't, if you cut a furrow into this sandy soil, like stuff is going to want to pop back out. But if this had more clay content, it's going to want to stick a little bit. So it depends on your goals. So for like, let's say you have older no-till technology and maybe like the coulters aren't that sharp, or you just don't have coulters which cut through the debris. Spraying might work better for that environment, because if you spray and then come back a couple weeks later, the material is a little bit easier to get through if you have older equipment or smaller equipment. If you're organic, you're not going to spray. So rolling might be better, or planting green might be better. It really depends on your goals. If you need to keep that vetch from going to seed because you need to have a cool season crop the next year, like wheat, then you might really have to spray because you really don't want vetch coming up in your wheat crop. So it's goal dependent. But soil type plays a big role, because like I wouldn't roll out here if I was a producer, because a roller is not going to work well in this sandy soil. If I was a producer, I might plant green here just because it's not that hard to get through. And that is one of the benefits of planting this low rate of cereal rye at 24 pounds per acre. This would be easy enough to get through planting green. This isn't a heavy stand. But if this was like 80 pounds per acre of rye and fertilized, this would be difficult. It's going to hairpin on the front of the coulters. It's going to drag. It's going to create problems. So it wouldn't be a smart choice. And in that case, maybe rolling works, or maybe spraying is the best if you're not organic. Yeah, rolling it would make a little bit more uniform planting bed slightly in this environment. But it has a carbon cost, because the equipment has to push that roller. So you're going to be burning a lot more diesel, because it's like forced friction going forward. And I don't know, the roller probably weighs a couple 1,000 pounds. So yeah, it's like that carbon offset in my mind. You probably wouldn't gain anything out here with the roller versus planting green. In theory, like with planting green, you're still going to fold over the stuff a little bit, and you're leaving the green stuff there. You know, it's on its way out. This rye is going to be going down. The clover is going to be going down, whatever's going to be going down, but it's still going to be pretty moist, right? Because it's got moisture in it. So you're planting there, and it's leaving a moist environment down on ground level. And what do you get with a moist environment down on ground level is slugs. You spray, that stuff's drying off. You don't have the slug problem. But you're also not retaining moisture. If you spray it, that stuff dries out. Then what's going to keep the soil moisture in? It's going to start evaporating. So you've got that trade-off there as well.